My name is Martin Weaver. I'm a landscape photographer, though these days I feel more like a ghost chasing shadows. A year ago, my wife Catherine passed away from cancer, and ever since, I've been trying to fill the emptiness she left behind. Photography was always my escape, but now it feels more like an obsession to find something I can't explain. That's what brought me to Echo Canyon in the summer of 1995. It's a remote box canyon near Sedona, Arizona, famous for its strange energy vortexes and electromagnetic anomalies. People say it's a place where the rules of nature don't apply, where the air hums with something unearthly. To me, it sounded like the perfect place to lose myself, and maybe find something I wasn't even looking for. The drive into the canyon was long and lonely. My motorhome, a beat-up 1978 GMC I'd converted into a mobile darkroom, rattled over the dirt road as red rock formations loomed on either side. Some of the rocks looked almost human, like distorted statues frozen. In mid-scream, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. When I finally parked near a cluster of ancient petroglyphs carved into the canyon walls, I stepped out and felt the heat hit me like a furnace blast. It was scorching during the day, but I knew from my research that the nights here could be freezing cold. The air was still except for the occasional dust devil swirling in the distance. I set up my camera gear and took a moment to study the petroglyphs. The carvings showed strange figures with elongated limbs and too many joints, almost insect-like. They reminded me of something out of a nightmare, but I couldn't look away. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no sounds around me. No birds, no insects, nothing but the faint hum of wind through the rocks. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the canyon itself was swallowing the noise. As I started setting up my first shot, something caught my eye through the lens. A flicker of movement on a distant cliff edge. It was just for a second, but it looked like her. Catherine. My heart skipped a beat as I lowered the camera and squinted at the cliff, but there was nothing there now. Just empty rock bathed in fading sunlight. I shook it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and got back to work. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this place was watching me. That night, as I developed my first roll of film in the tiny darkroom inside my RV, my hands trembled with anticipation. The photographs came out crisp and vivid, red rocks glowing under the setting sun, but then I noticed something that made my breath catch. In one of the shots, there was a faint silhouette in the background, a figure standing on that same cliff edge where I thought I'd seen Catherine earlier. It couldn't be her. Could it? Before I could think too much about it, there was a knock on my RV door. Startled, I grabbed a flashlight and opened it to find a woman standing there with a clipboard and a curious expression. "Dr. Eliza Hamilton," she said with a polite smile. "I'm studying this area's magnetic properties for some research." She glanced at my camera gear inside and added, "You've picked an interesting spot for photography." We talked for a while, and she warned me about how strange things could get out here. Electronics malfunctioning, compasses spinning wildly, even people feeling disoriented or seeing things that weren't there. "Just be careful," she said before heading back to her own campsite down the road. As I closed the door behind her and looked back at that eerie photo of Catherine's silhouette, one thought kept echoing in my mind. What have I gotten myself into? The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my RV creaking in the wind. The sun was already blazing, and the canyon walls glowed a deep, rusty red. I stepped outside, camera in hand, ready to explore. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near my campsite. They weren't mine. The prints were faint, almost like they'd been made a long time ago, but they led away from my RV and disappeared into the rocks. I crouched down to get a closer look and felt a chill crawl up my spine. They looked human, but something about them seemed off. The toes were too long, the spacing uneven. I shook my head and stood up, brushing it off as nothing. Maybe they were just distorted by the wind or erosion. That's what I told myself anyway. I spent most of the day hiking through the canyon, taking photos of the jagged cliffs and strange rock formations. The air felt heavy, like there was a storm coming, even though the sky was clear and blue. Every so often, I'd hear faint whispers on the wind, just barely audible. But when I stopped to listen, there was nothing there. Around midday, I ran into someone unexpected. Vincent Reeves. Vincent used to be my assistant years ago when I was first starting out as a photographer. We hadn't spoken in a long time, not since Catherine had gotten sick. Seeing him here felt like a punch to the gut. "Martin," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't expect to see you here." I didn't know what to say at first. There was too much history between us. Too many things left unsaid. Vincent had always been charming, talented, and ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. Back when we worked together, I'd always suspected he had feelings for Catherine. And now here he was, showing up in the one place where I thought I could escape. Everything. "What are you doing here?" I finally asked. "Same as you," he said, holding up his camera. "This place is incredible. Perfect for my next project." I nodded stiffly and tried to keep my tone neutral. "Well, good luck." He smirked like he knew exactly what I was thinking, but didn't say anything else. As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that his being here wasn't a coincidence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the canyon floor, something strange happened. I was setting up my tripod near a shallow creek when I noticed ripples in the water, like someone had just walked through it, but there was no one there. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement on the far side of the creek, a figure standing still among the rocks. It was Catherine, or at least, it looked like her. She was wearing the same sundress she used to wear on our trips together, yellow, with little white flowers, and her hair caught the fading light just like it used to. My heart pounded in my chest as I called out her name. "Catherine!" She didn't move or respond. She just stood there, watching me. I scrambled across the creek to get closer, but by the time I reached where she had been standing, she was gone. There were no footprints in the dirt, nothing to prove she'd been there at all. Back at camp that night, I developed more film in my RV's darkroom. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost ruined one of the negatives. When the images finally came into focus under the red light of the darkroom lamp, my stomach dropped. In every photo I'd taken that day, every single one, there was a shadowy figure in the background. Sometimes it was standing on a distant cliff. Other times it was barely visible among the rocks or trees, but it was always there, watching me. And then there was one photo that made me freeze completely. It showed me standing by my RV earlier that morning, but there were two of me in the frame. One version of me stood by the door of my motorhome like normal, but another version of me stood several feet away, half hidden in shadow, staring directly at the camera with an expression that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled back from the photo table and nearly knocked over my equipment. My breathing was shallow. My chest felt tight. What was happening here? Was this some kind of trick? A glitch in my camera? Or was this canyon playing games with me? Before I could process any of it further, there came another knock at my door. A loud, urgent banging this time that made me jump out of my skin. When I opened it, Tomas Begay, the Navajo guide who worked around these parts, was standing there, with a flashlight in hand and an expression that screamed, "Stay inside." "You shouldn't be out here after dark," he said firmly. "Why not?" I asked, still rattled from everything that had happened. He hesitated for a moment before answering quietly, "There are places in this canyon where things don't belong. Things that wear stolen skins." His words sent a chill down my spine that no amount of logic could shake. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The air in the canyon was heavier than before, like it was pressing down on me. Tomas's warning from the night before kept replaying in my mind. things that wear stolen skins. What did he mean? Was it just a local legend, or was there something real behind his words? I decided to focus on my photography to keep myself grounded. I packed my gear and hiked deeper into the canyon, following a narrow trail that wound between towering rock formations. The silence was unsettling. No birds, no insects, just the occasional whisper of wind through the rocks. Even my footsteps felt muffled, like the ground itself was absorbing the sound. As I set up my camera near a small pool of water, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the water didn't match what I was seeing above it. The sky in the reflection was darker, almost stormy, even though the real sky was clear and blue. And then I saw her again, Catherine. She was standing on the opposite side of the pool, her yellow sundress swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes looked wrong. They were slightly too far apart and they didn't blink. I froze, unable to move or speak. She raised her hand slowly, as if beckoning me to come closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I whispered her name. Catherine? She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away into the rocks, disappearing, behind a jagged cliff edge. I scrambled to follow her, but when I reached the spot where she had been standing, there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Back at camp that afternoon, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Was my grief playing tricks on me? Was it possible that I wanted to see Catherine so badly that my mind was creating illusions? But then, there were the photos. I developed the film in my RV's darkroom and stared at the images in disbelief. In every shot I'd taken near the pool, Catherine's figure appeared in the background, sometimes clear as day, sometimes just a faint shadow. But she wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere. And then there were other anomalies, things I couldn't explain. In one photo, the pool's reflection showed storm clouds swirling above me even though the sky had been sunny all day. In another shot, there were figures standing among the rocks, tall and thin with elongated limbs, but when I looked closer at the negatives, those figures weren't there anymore. Later that evening, Vincent showed up at my campsite again. He seemed too casual for someone wandering around this eerie place. "Martin," he said with a grin as he leaned against his tripod, "you've been busy." "What do you want?" I asked sharply. He held up a stack of photographs he'd taken earlier that day and handed them to me without saying a word. As I flipped through them, my stomach dropped. The photos showed some of the same locations I'd been photographing, but they looked completely different. In Vincent's shots, rock formations were missing or altered entirely. One photo showed a petroglyph-covered cliff that had been wiped clean of carvings. Another showed a creek bed filled with water even though it had been dry when I passed it earlier. "How is this possible?" I asked him. Vincent shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "This place messes with reality," he said simply. "You'll get used to it." His calmness unnerved me more than anything else. It felt like he knew something he wasn't telling me, something about this canyon, or about Catherine. That night, as I tried to sleep in my RV, strange noises began outside, soft whispers carried by the wind and faint tapping sounds against the windows. At first, I thought it might be animals or branches scraping against the glass, but when I peeked outside with my flashlight, there was nothing there. Locked all the doors and tried to ignore it, but then my radio crackled to life on its own, even though it wasn't turned on. At first, it was just static, but then voices began filtering through, faint and distorted like they were coming from far away or underwater. "Martin," one voice said softly. My blood ran cold as I recognized it immediately. It was Catherine's voice. "Martin," she repeated. "Come back." I stared at the radio in disbelief as tears welled up in my eyes. Was this real? Was she trying to reach me somehow? Or was this canyon playing tricks on me? Before I could react further, another knock came at my RV door, louder and more urgent than before. When I opened it this time, Sheriff Joseph Tallman stood there with a flashlight and a grim expression. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "What's going on?" I asked him. "There have been reports of missing hikers," he said bluntly. "2 people vanished near your campsite yesterday." My heart sank as he continued. "And whatever's out here, it's not human." After my conversation with Sheriff Tallman, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The canyon seemed quieter than usual, the air heavier, as if it were holding its breath. I spent the day hiking and photographing, trying to distract myself from the unease creeping into my thoughts. But as the hours passed, the strange occurrences only grew worse. It started with Catherine. I saw her again, this time on a cliff edge overlooking the canyon. She stood there, perfectly still, her yellow sundress fluttering in a wind that didn't exist. Her face was turned toward me, but her features seemed blurred, like I was looking at her through frosted glass. I called out to her, my voice echoing strangely in the canyon walls. "Catherine!" She didn't move or respond, but I swear I saw her smile. A small, unnatural smile that sent chills down my spine. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing behind the rocks. I scrambled up the cliff to follow her, my camera swinging against my side as I climbed. But when I reached the top, there was no one there, just empty rock and silence. Back at my RV that evening, things got worse. The mirrors inside began acting strangely. At first, it was subtle. My reflection seemed delayed by half a second, moving just after I did. But then it became impossible to ignore. As I stared into the bathroom mirror, my reflection smiled at me, even though I wasn't smiling. I stumbled back in shock, knocking over a bottle of silver nitrate from my darkroom supplies. My heart pounded as I stared at the mirror, but my reflection had returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be in this place. Later that night, Vincent showed up again at my campsite. He didn't knock this time. He just stood outside, in the darkness, until I noticed him through the window. "Martin," he said when I opened the door, "we need to talk." His tone was calm but serious, and his eyes held something I couldn't quite read. Fear? Regret? Guilt? "What do you want?" I asked him. He handed me a stack of photographs he'd taken earlier that day without saying a word. As I flipped through them, my stomach dropped. The photos showed some of the same locations I'd been photographing, but they looked completely different. In one shot, a cliff edge was missing entirely. In another, a creek bed was filled with water, even though it had been dry when I passed it earlier. "How is this possible?" I asked him. Vincent shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "This place messes with reality," he said simply. "You'll see." His casual tone unnerved me more than anything else. It felt like he knew something he wasn't telling me. Something either about this canyon or about Catherine. As night fell and shadows stretched across the canyon floor, things took an even darker turn. I was sitting in my RV when the radio crackled to life on its own, even though it wasn't turned on. At first, it was just static, but then voices began filtering through, faint and distorted like they were coming from far away or underwater. "Martin," one voice said softly. My blood ran cold as I recognized it immediately. It was Catherine's voice. "Martin," she repeated. "Come back." I stared at the radio in disbelief as tears welled up in my eyes. Was this real? Was she trying to reach me somehow? Or was this canyon playing tricks on me? Before I could react further, there came another knock at my RV door, a loud and urgent banging that made me jump out of my skin. When I opened it this time, Dr. Hamilton stood there with a flashlight and a look of concern on her face. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "What's going on?" I asked her. She hesitated for a moment before answering quietly. "There's something here. Something we don't understand." Her words sent a chill down my spine that no amount of logic could shake. Dr. Hamilton's words stayed with me long after she left. She didn't explain much, but her urgency was clear. Something was happening in this canyon, and it wasn't just in my head. I decided I needed answers, so the next morning I drove into town to visit the local historical society. The building was small and dusty, filled with old maps, faded photographs, and handwritten journals from decades past. A woman at the front desk pointed me toward a shelf labeled Echo Canyon. As I flipped through the books and papers, a pattern began to emerge. Stories of strange disappearances, sightings of shadowy figures, and whispers of Navajo legends about skinwalkers. One journal caught my attention. It belonged to a Spanish explorer who had passed through the area centuries ago. His entries described echo people, who mimicked the voices and appearances of his men, leading them into the wilderness where they were never seen again. He wrote about how the land felt alive, how it seemed to twist and change when he wasn't looking. Another document was a file compiled by Sheriff Tallman's department. It listed dozens of missing persons cases spanning decades, all tied to Echo Canyon. Each case had the same eerie details: footprints leading nowhere, belongings left behind without explanation, and witnesses claiming to see people who shouldn't have been there. I felt a chill as I read through the reports. It was clear that whatever was happening here had been going on for a long time, and it wasn't just folklore. When I returned to my RV that afternoon, Tomas Begay was waiting for me near the petroglyphs. He looked uneasy, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You shouldn't be here," he said bluntly. "I need answers," I told him. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "This place, it's not safe. There are things here that don't belong, things that take what isn't theirs." "What do you mean?" I asked. He pointed toward the petroglyphs carved into the canyon walls. "The people who made these knew about them, the ones who wear stolen skins. They're not human, but they can look like us." His words sent shivers down my spine. "Have you seen them?" I asked quietly. Tomas nodded slowly. "Once, when I was a kid. My uncle took me hunting near here. We saw someone walking through the trees, a man we thought we knew, but when we called out to him, he didn't answer. When he turned around, his eyes were wrong." "What happened?" I asked. "We ran," Tomas said simply, "and we never came back." That evening, as the sun set and shadows stretched across the canyon floor, I decided to visit one of the sites Tomas had warned me about, a narrow ravine filled with strange rock formations that looked almost alive. As I walked through the ravine, the air grew colder despite the heat of the day fading behind me. The rocks seemed to hum faintly, like they were vibrating just below the threshold of hearing. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the ravine. It looked like Catherine again, her yellow sundress glowing faintly in the twilight. But this time, something was different. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I raised my camera instinctively and snapped a photo before she disappeared into the shadows. Back at camp, that night, I developed the film in my darkroom and stared at the images in disbelief. The photo showed Catherine standing in the ravine, but her face wasn't hers anymore. It was distorted and stretched, her eyes too far apart and her mouth twisted into an unnatural smile. I felt sick as I stared at the photo, but then something else caught my attention, something in the background behind her. There were other figures standing among the rocks, tall and thin with elongated limbs, and they were all staring directly at me. The night after I developed that photo, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Catherine's distorted face staring back at me. The figures in the background haunted me too, those tall, thin shapes with their unnatural limbs and hollow stares. What were they? And why did they seem to be watching me? I sat in the RV with all the lights on, my camera on the table in front of me. The silence outside was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the wind against the canyon walls. Then, just past midnight, I saw them. 3 park rangers walking toward my campsite. At first, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe they were here to check on me or investigate the missing hikers Sheriff Tallman had mentioned. But as they got closer, something about them seemed wrong. Their movements were stiff, almost robotic, and their faces were blank, expressionless in a way that made my skin crawl. They didn't call out or wave, they just kept walking toward my RV in perfect unison. I grabbed my camera and snapped a photo through the window. The flash lit up the darkness for a split second, and when I looked at the image on the camera's screen, my stomach turned. The rangers' faces weren't there. Their heads were smooth and featureless, like someone had erased their faces entirely. And behind them, in the shadows of the canyon, I saw something else. A figure crouched low to the ground with glowing eyes and limbs that bent in ways no humans ever could. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The rangers were getting closer now, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel outside. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Hide? Call for help? Before I could decide, there was a loud knock at the door. "Open up," one of them said, in a flat, monotone voice. I froze. Something about their tone sent chills down my spine. It wasn't quite human. It was like someone trying to imitate a voice but getting it just slightly wrong. "Go away," I shouted, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped, but then I heard something even worse. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. It was coming from the side of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through one of the windows. That's when I saw it. The figure from the photo. It was hunched over near one of the tires, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. Its head snapped up when the light hit it, and for a moment we locked eyes. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a nightmare. Its features were stretched and distorted, its mouth too wide and filled with jagged teeth. And its eyes. Its eyes burned with an unnatural yellow glow that seemed to pierce right through me. I stumbled back from the window as it let out a low growl, a sound that didn't belong in this world. The next morning, Sheriff Tallman came by to check on me after hearing reports of strange lights near my campsite. When I told him what had happened, he didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first person to see things out here," he said grimly, "and you won't be the last." He showed me photos from previous investigations, images of mutilated animals, strange symbols carved into rocks, and even blurry snapshots of figures that looked eerily similar to what I'd seen. "Whatever's out here," he said quietly, "it doesn't want us here." Later that day, as I explored more of the canyon with my camera in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between rocks or a flicker of light where there shouldn't be any. At one point I found myself standing in front of a shallow cave carved into the side of a cliff. Something about it felt wrong. The air around it was colder than anywhere else in the canyon, and there was a faint hum coming from deep inside. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer and shone my flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated strange markings on the walls, symbols that looked ancient and alien at the same time. And then I saw them, footprints leading deeper into the cave. They weren't human footprints, they were too large and clawed, but they looked fresh. I didn't stick around to find out what made them. After the encounter with the faceless rangers in the cave, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The canyon wasn't just eerie anymore. It felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. My thoughts were clouded, my memories jumbled. Sometimes I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. The strangest part was the time slips. One moment, I'd be walking along a trail, the sun high in the sky. The next, it was dusk, and I'd be standing somewhere completely different with no memory of how I got there. Hours vanished without explanation, leaving me disoriented and scared. Even my photographs didn't make sense anymore. I developed a roll of film one afternoon and found images I didn't remember taking. shots of places I hadn't visited and people who shouldn't have been there. One photo showed me standing by my RV, but there were two versions of me in the frame, one looking normal and the other staring directly at the camera with a twisted smile. Another photo showed Catherine standing by the petroglyphs, her yellow sundress glowing faintly in the sunlight. But her face wasn't hers. It was stretched and distorted, her eyes too far apart and her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Dr. Hamilton came by later that day with her research equipment. She seemed tense, her usual calm demeanor replaced by something closer to fear. "I've been recording heat signatures around the canyon," she said as she set up a monitor in my RV, "and something isn't right." She showed me the data, a series of overlapping heat patterns that moved in perfect synchronization. At first glance, they looked like normal human figures, but when she zoomed in, it became clear that they weren't human at all. "They're identical," she said quietly. "Every movement is perfectly matched, like they're copies of each other." I stared at the screen in disbelief. "What does it mean?" Dr. Hamilton hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not natural." That evening, Vincent showed up again at my campsite. He looked pale and shaken, his usual cocky attitude replaced by something closer to desperation. "We need to talk," he said. "What now?" I asked him, exhausted from everything that had happened. Vincent hesitated before speaking again. "Catherine, she came here before." I froze. "What are you talking about?" "She came here last year," he said quietly. "Before she got sick." My heart sank as he continued. "She told me she was seeing things, shadows following her, voices calling her name, just like what's happening to you now." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Why didn't you tell me?" "She didn't want you to know," Vincent said softly. "She thought it would pass, but then she started changing." "Changing how?" I asked. Vincent looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wasn't herself anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was Catherine's illness connected to this canyon? Had she been drawn here for the same reason I was? That night, as I tried to sleep in my RV, the whispers started again. Soft voices carried by the wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Martin." It was Catherine's voice again. "Martin, come back." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as tears welled up in my eyes. Was she really out there? Or was this canyon playing tricks on me? I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside into the darkness. The air was cold and still, the stars barely visible through a thin veil of clouds. "Catherine," I called out. There was no answer, just silence. And then I saw it, a figure standing near the petroglyphs at the edge of my campsite. It looked like Catherine again, her yellow sundress glowing faintly in the moonlight. But something about her felt wrong, this time. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I took a step closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Catherine," I whispered again. She turned slowly to face me, and that's when I saw her eyes. They weren't Catherine's eyes anymore. They were glowing yellow like fireflies trapped behind glass. I froze. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam flickering as it landed on her face. It was Catherine, or at least it looked like her, but those glowing yellow eyes, they weren't hers. They couldn't be. "Catherine," I whispered again, my voice trembling. She tilted her head slightly like she was trying to understand me. Her movements were slow and deliberate, almost mechanical. Then she smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You came back for me," she said softly. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, gentle, warm, and familiar. But there was something off about the way she spoke. The words felt rehearsed, like someone trying to mimic her but not quite getting it right. I don't understand, I stammered. You're gone. She took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound on the rocky ground. I never left, she said. I've been here all along, waiting for you. Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this really her? Had she somehow survived? Or was this canyon playing tricks on me again? Catherine, I said, my voice breaking. If it's really you, prove it. She paused for a moment, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. Then she spoke again, her tone softer this time. Do you remember our trip to Big Sur? She asked. The way the waves crashed against the cliffs? You said it was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen. My breath caught in my throat. That memory was real, something only Catherine would know. But before I could respond, Sheriff Tallman's voice called out from behind me. Martin, get back! I turned to see him running toward me with his flashlight in one hand and his revolver in the other. When I looked back at Catherine, her expression had changed. The warmth in her face was gone, replaced by something cold and predatory. Martin, she whispered, her voice now low and guttural. Don't listen to him. Before I could react, she lunged at me with impossible speed. Her hands, no longer human, reached for my face, her fingers elongated and claw-like. Sheriff Tallman fired his gun, the deafening crack echoing through the canyon. Catherine, or whatever she was, let out an inhuman screech and stumbled backward into the shadows. Inside. Now, Tallman shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the RV. Once inside, we locked the doors and turned off all the lights. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold on to my flashlight. What was that? I asked. My voice barely above a whisper. Tallman's face was pale, his jaw clenched tightly. That wasn't your wife, he said flatly. Whatever's out there, it's not human. I sank into a chair, my mind racing as tears streamed down my face. But she knew things only Catherine would know. They mimic, Tallman said grimly. They watch us, learn from us, and then they take what they want. I stared at him in disbelief. You're saying that thing is… what? A skinwalker? He hesitated before nodding slowly. That's what Tomas calls them. The ones who wear stolen skins. My stomach churned as his words sank in. If that thing wasn't Catherine, then what had happened to her? And why did it want me? As we sat in the dark RV, Tallman explained what he knew, or at least what he suspected. These things have been here for centuries, he said quietly. Long before we ever came to this land, the Navajo believe they're spirits, evil ones, that can take on the form of anything they choose. But why are they here? I asked. Tallman shook his head. I don't know, but they seem drawn to certain people who are grieving or vulnerable. He looked at me pointedly as he said this. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I thought about Catherine and how much I'd missed her since she passed away. Had my grief, somehow, drawn these things to me? Was that why I kept seeing her? Before we could say anything else, there was a loud bang on the side of the RV, a sound so sudden and violent that it made both of us jump. They're here, Tallman said grimly as he raised his revolver. The banging grew louder and more frantic, like something, or someone, was trying to break in. Martin, a voice called from outside. It was Catherine's voice again, but this time it sounded distorted and wrong, like it was coming from an old tape recorder running out of batteries. Don't open the door, Tallman warned as he aimed his gun at the entrance. But then something even worse happened. The mirrors inside the RV began to ripple like water, and my reflection stepped out of one of them. It wasn't me, not really, but it looked exactly like me, except for its eyes. They glowed yellow in the dim light of the RV's interior. Martin, it said with a twisted smile that didn't belong on my face. I couldn't breathe. My reflection, or whatever it was, stood there, grinning at me with those glowing yellow eyes. It tilted its head, mimicking the way I had done earlier that day when I was confused. It was like watching a puppet version of myself, but the strings were being pulled by something far darker. "Martin," it said again, its voice calm but hollow, like an echo in an empty room. "You don't belong here." Sheriff Tallman didn't hesitate. He fired his revolver at the thing, the sound deafening in the small RV. The bullet hit it square in the chest, but instead of falling, it just rippled. Its body shimmered like heat waves on asphalt. And then it started to change. Its arms stretched unnaturally long, its fingers growing into sharp claws. Its face twisted and warped until it barely resembled mine anymore. The grin widened impossibly, splitting its face almost in half. "Get out!" Tallman yelled as he grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the door. The banging outside had stopped, but now the entire RV shook violently, as if something massive was circling us. I could hear whispers all around. Catherine's voice, my own voice, voices I didn't recognize, all blending together into a haunting chorus. We burst out of the RV into the cold night air. The canyon was eerily silent now, the only sound our frantic footsteps crunching on gravel as we ran toward the petroglyphs. "They don't like these," Tallman said between breaths, pointing at the ancient carvings on the rock walls. "The symbols, they keep them away." I didn't have time to question him. The air behind us seemed to crackle and hum with energy, and when I glanced back I saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness. Some looked human, others didn't. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. And their eyes. Every single one of them had those glowing yellow eyes. We reached the petroglyphs and stopped to catch our breath. Tallman pulled out a small pouch from his jacket and sprinkled a silvery powder along the ground near the carvings. "What is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Silver," he said simply. "It slows them down." I nodded numbly and turned to face the canyon. The figures had stopped just beyond the line of silver powder, their glowing eyes fixed on us. They didn't move or speak. They just stood there, watching. And then she appeared. Catherine. She stepped forward from among the figures, her yellow sundress glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her face was calm again, almost serene, but her eyes betrayed her. They burned with that same unnatural light. "Martin," she said softly, "why are you running from me?" My heart ached at the sound of her voice. It was so familiar, so real, but I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. "You're not Catherine," I said firmly. Though my voice wavered, her expression didn't change. "I am," she insisted. "I've always been here, waiting for you." "No," I said, again, louder this time. "Catherine is gone." Her smile faded slightly as she tilted her head to one side. "She doesn't have to be," she said quietly. Before I could respond, Dr. Hamilton appeared out of nowhere, carrying a strange device that looked like a cross between a radio and a car battery. "Get back," she shouted as she flipped a switch on the device. A loud hum filled the air as blue sparks crackled around it. The figures beyond the silver line recoiled slightly, their forms flickering like bad TV reception. "What is that?" I asked her. "An electromagnetic pulse generator," she said quickly. "It disrupts their cohesion, but it won't hold them for long." The figures began to advance again despite the device's effects. Their movements were slower now, but no less menacing. "We need to trap them," Hamilton said urgently. "How?" I asked desperately. She pointed at my camera bag. "Silver nitrate," she said. "You have some in your darkroom supplies, right?" I nodded quickly and pulled out a small bottle of silver nitrate solution from my bag. "Use it," she said. "The petroglyphs show how they were trapped before. Mirrors and silver." I glanced at the carvings on the rock wall and saw what she meant. Figures surrounded by reflective surfaces with lines of silver encircling them. Tallman and I worked quickly while Hamilton kept the creatures at bay with her device. We used shards. of broken mirrors from my RV and poured silver nitrate around them to create a makeshift trap near one of the largest petroglyphs. As soon as we finished, Hamilton's device sputtered and died with a final burst of sparks. "They're coming!" she yelled as the figures surged forward all at once. Catherine, or whatever was wearing her skin, led them straight toward us. Her glowing eyes locked onto mine as she reached out with clawed hands. "Martin," she whispered one last time before stepping into the trap. The moment she crossed into the circle of mirrors and silver nitrate, her form began to distort violently. She let out an ear-piercing shriek as her body twisted and flickered like static on a broken TV screen. The other figures tried to follow, but were pulled into the trap as well, their forms merging into Catherine's until there was nothing left but a swirling mass of shadows trapped within the circle. And then, silence. Tallman collapsed onto the ground beside me while Hamilton inspected what remained of the trap, a faint shimmer in the air where Catherine had stood moments before. "It's over," Hamilton said quietly. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I believed her. The canyon was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like the world has stopped breathing. Sheriff Tallman, Dr. Hamilton, and I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the faint shimmer where the trap had worked. The figures were gone. Catherine was gone, but the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. "Is it over?" I asked, softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Hamilton hesitated before nodding. "For now," she said, though her tone didn't sound confident. Tallman got to his feet, brushing the dust off his pants. "We need to leave this place," he said, firmly. "Now." I didn't argue. I packed up my camera gear in silence, my hands trembling as I zipped up the bag. The three of us walked back to my RV together, the air around us feeling heavier with every step. When we reached the RV, I turned to look at the canyon one last time. The petroglyphs glowed faintly in the moonlight, their strange symbols etched into my memory forever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the shadows. The drive out of Echo Canyon was long and quiet. Tallman rode with me in the RV while Dr. Hamilton followed in her truck. None of us spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say. As the miles passed and the canyon disappeared behind us, I started to feel a strange sense of relief. Maybe it really was over. Maybe I could finally move on. We stopped at a roadside motel just outside of Sedona for the night. Tallman and Hamilton checked into their rooms while I stayed in my RV, too restless to sleep. Instead, I decided to develop one last roll of film, the shots I'd taken right before everything fell apart. I set up my darkroom and began processing the negatives, my hands steady for the first time in days. As the images came into focus, under the red light, my stomach churned. The first few photos were normal, landscapes of the canyon, shots of the petroglyphs, but then I saw it. In one photo, taken just before we set up the trap, there was a figure standing in the background. It was blurry, but unmistakable. Catherine. Her face wasn't distorted this time. It looked exactly as I remembered it, beautiful and serene. But her eyes were glowing yellow. I stumbled back from the photo table, my heart racing as I stared at the image. How could she still be there? We'd trapped them, hadn't we? I tried to shake off the unease and went to bed a few hours later, but sleep didn't come easily. My dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, Catherine's voice calling out to me from somewhere far away. When I woke up just before dawn, something felt off. The air inside the RV was cold, colder than it should have been even for an early morning in Arizona. And then I saw it, the mirror on the wall near my bed. My reflection wasn't moving. I froze, staring at it as my breath caught in my throat. My reflection stood perfectly still while I sat up in bed, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto mine. And then it smiled, a slow, twisted grin that didn't belong on my face. Later that morning, as I prepared to leave the motel parking lot, something else caught my attention. A family pulling into Echo Canyon just as we had left it behind. A father, a mother, and two kids piled out of their car with excited smiles on their faces. I watched them from a distance as they unloaded their gear and started walking toward one of the trails leading into the canyon. For a moment, I thought about warning them, telling them to turn back before it was too late. But something stopped me. Instead, I reached for my camera and snapped a photo of them as they disappeared into the canyon's shadows. When I looked at the image on my camera's screen, I felt a chill run down my spine. In their reflection on a nearby window, my eyes stared back at me. My name is Mabel Thompson, and for the past 45 years, I've been married to Harold. He's my everything, my partner, my best friend, and the man who makes me laugh even when life feels heavy. But lately, things have been different. Harold's memory isn't what it used to be, and sometimes I catch him staring off into space like he's lost in a place I can't follow. He hasn't told me, but I know something is wrong. This summer, we decided to take a trip to Redwood National Park in California. Harold said it would be good for us to get away, just the two of us like we used to before retirement. We packed up our old 1968 Airstream land yacht and hit the road. I brought along my books on folklore. I've always loved stories about old legends, and Harold packed his fishing gear. When we arrived at the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was peak season, but the place was eerily quiet. No kids running around, no campfires crackling in the distance, just silence. The towering redwoods stretched high above us, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. A strange fog clung to the ground like it didn't want to leave, even though it was midday. Harold parked the RV and started unloading our things while I looked around. That's when I saw it. A child's stuffed bear lying near the edge of the woods. Looked old and dirty with strange bite marks on its arms and legs. I pointed it out to Harold, but he just shrugged and said it was probably left behind by another family. Still, he picked it up and tucked it away in a drawer inside the RV without telling me why. That first night, things started to get strange. We'd packed plenty of food for the trip, canned goods, fresh vegetables, even some steaks. But when I opened the fridge to make dinner, everything had spoiled. The fridge was working fine. There was no reason for it to happen. Harold brushed it off as bad luck and suggested we eat peanut butter sandwiches instead. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, Harold froze by the window. His face went pale and his hands started shaking like he'd seen a ghost. When I asked him what was wrong, he said he thought he heard someone calling his name from deep in the woods, a voice that sounded just like his brother's. I didn't know what to say. Harold's brother drowned 50 years ago when they were teenagers. It's something he rarely talks about. It's probably just your mind playing tricks, I told him gently. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. As we lay in bed that night, listening to the drizzle tapping against the RV roof, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from outside. The next morning, Harold woke up before me, which was unusual. He's always been a late riser, but lately he's been restless. When I stepped outside the RV to find him, he was standing by the edge of the woods, staring at something. "What are you looking at?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "There's an RV over there. Looks abandoned." I followed his gaze and saw it. A large RV parked crookedly under the trees, its door hanging open like someone had left in a hurry. Harold insisted we check it out, so we walked over together. Inside, it was a mess. Plates of half-eaten breakfast sat on the table and the food was still warm. Toys were scattered across the floor, action figures and coloring books, but there was no sign of the family who owned them. It felt like they'd vanished into thin air. Harold looked uneasy as he picked up one of the toys, a little plastic dinosaur, and stared at it for a long time before putting it back down. "Maybe they went hiking," I suggested. But even I didn't believe it. Why would anyone leave food on the table like that? When we got back to our RV, Ranger Douglas Everett stopped by to check on us. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Harold told him about the abandoned RV, but Douglas didn't seem surprised. "It happens every generation or so," he said cryptically, looking out at the woods like he knew something we didn't. "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. Douglas hesitated before answering. "People go missing sometimes. The forest, it has a way of keeping secrets." I wanted to ask more, but Harold cut him off and changed the subject. I could tell he didn't want me worrying about things we couldn't explain. That evening, as Harold was setting up a fire outside, I noticed something strange on one of the trees near our campsite. Symbols carved into the bark. They weren't like anything I'd seen before. Jagged lines and shapes that seemed to form some kind of pattern. "Harold," I called out, "did you see these carvings?" He walked over and frowned at them, but didn't say much. "Probably kids messing around," he muttered before turning back to the fire. But I wasn't so sure. The carvings looked fresh, like they hadn't been there long. And when I checked, again the next morning, there were more symbols on different trees. By now, Harold was acting different. He was eating more than usual, huge portions that would normally make him sick, but he still seemed hungry all the time. His mood was changing too. He was snappy and short-tempered in ways I hadn't seen before. One night after dinner, Harold pulled out his old cassette recorder, the one he used to use in his science classes, and started recording himself talking. Oh, about our trip. He said it was to help him remember things better since his memory wasn't what it used to be. But when we played back the tape later that night, something wasn't right. His voice sounded normal at first, calm and steady, but then another voice joined in halfway through, soft and whispery like someone else was speaking alongside him. It sounded just like his brother's voice. Harold froze when he heard it and refused to play it again. The next few days felt like the forest was closing in on us. Everything seemed off. The fog never lifted, even when the sun was high in the sky. The air felt colder than it should for summer, and the drizzle that had been falling since we arrived turned into a heavier, warmer rain that made my skin crawl. Harold wasn't himself anymore. He was eating constantly, anything he could get his hands on, and still complaining about being hungry. I caught him sneaking out of the RV in the middle of the night once, standing near the woods, mumbling to himself. When I asked him what he was doing, he just shook his head and said, "Nothing. Go back to bed." But I couldn't sleep. Not after what happened with the cassette tape. One morning, while Harold was out wandering near the edge of the campsite, I decided to clean up inside the RV. That's when I found them. Polaroid photos tucked under one of the seat cushions. At first, I thought they were ours, but as I flipped through them, my stomach dropped. The photos showed people, a family of 5, standing near their RV, smiling at first. But as I kept looking, the smiles disappeared. Each photo showed them, looking thinner and weaker, their clothes hanging off their bodies like they hadn't eaten in weeks. The last photo was the worst. They were lying on the ground in a circle, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed like they'd starved to death. I didn't tell Harold about the photos. He was already acting strange enough. I didn't want to scare him more than he already seemed to be. That night, as we sat by the fire outside, Marcus White Eagle appeared out of nowhere. He was a local guide we'd heard about but hadn't met until now. A quiet man with long black hair and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through you. "You shouldn't be here," Marcus said bluntly, looking at Harold first and then at me. "What do you mean?" I asked nervously. "There's something in these woods," he said, his voice low and serious. "Something old. It feeds on guilt, on hunger." Harold scoffed and waved him off like he didn't believe a word of it, but Marcus wasn't done. "It's called the Wendigo," Marcus continued. "It's not just a story. It's real. It's been here for generations." He handed me 2 small talismans made of twisted branches and feathers tied together with string. "Keep these close," he said before disappearing back into the trees without another word. I wanted to ask him more, what it was exactly, how we could protect ourselves, but he was gone before I could say anything. The next morning, Harold found Ranger Douglas Everett, or what was left of him. He was hanging from a tree near our campsite, his body limp and broken like a rag doll. His eyes were still open, blinking slowly like he was somehow alive despite being partially eaten. Harold screamed when he saw it and ran back to the RV without saying anything. I followed him inside and locked the door behind us. After what Harold found, I knew we couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and it wasn't just the forest. It was Harold, too. He was quieter now, barely speaking to me unless I asked him something directly. He spent most of his time pacing inside the RV or staring out the window, at the woods. His appetite was worse than ever. I watched him eat an entire loaf of bread in one sitting, and he still looked like he wanted more. I needed answers. While Harold stayed behind, I went to the visitor center to see if I could find anything that would explain what was going on. The place was empty except for an old man behind the desk who barely looked up when I walked in. There were stacks of old newspapers in one corner, and I started flipping through them, hoping to find something useful. That's when I saw it. A headline from 1954. Family of 4 vanishes in Redwood National Park. I kept digging and found more articles, all with similar stories. People disappearing without a trace every 22 years. 1932, 1910, 1888. It went back as far as 1844. Every time it happened during the summer, always near the same area of the park, the grove where we were camping. One article mentioned a journal written by a settler who lived near the park in the early 1800s. He described a creature that haunted the woods, a Wendigo, that preyed on people who were vulnerable, especially those consumed by guilt or hunger. I felt my chest tighten as I read the words. Marcus had warned us about this, but Harold hadn't listened. Now I wasn't sure if it was too late. When I got back to the RV, Harold wasn't there. His shoes were gone, and the door was wide open. Panic set in as I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside to look for him. I found his tracks leading into the woods. Deep impressions in the mud like he'd been walking fast or stomping around angrily. They led to a clearing where something else caught my eye. Clothing scattered in a circle on the ground. It was small, children's clothing, and it looked like it had been arranged deliberately. Shirts, pants, socks, all laid out neatly like someone had placed them there on purpose. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what it meant. The Jensen family, the ones who owned the abandoned RV, they weren't just missing. Something had taken them. When I got back to our RV again, Harold was sitting at the table eating raw meat straight out of the fridge. His hands were shaking, and his face looked pale and gaunt like he hadn't slept in days. "Harold," I said softly, trying not to startle him, "what's happening to you?" He didn't answer right away. Then he looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "I can hear him. My brother." That night, the rain came down harder than ever. It wasn't cold anymore. It felt warm and sticky, like blood running down your skin. Harold was restless, pacing back and forth in the RV while I sat at the table, clutching the talisman Marcus had given me. "I need to go out there," Harold muttered suddenly, his voice low and shaky. "What?" "No, Harold. You're not going anywhere," I said firmly. He turned to look at me, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. His face seemed thinner, his cheekbones sharper. His eyes had a strange glint in them like he was seeing something I couldn't. "I heard him again," he said quietly. "My brother. He's calling for me." I grabbed his arm and tried to stop him, but he pulled away with more strength than I thought he had. Before I could say anything else, he opened the door and stepped out into the storm. "Harold." I shouted, running after him into the woods. The flashlight beam cut through the fog as I followed his tracks, but they didn't make sense. They zigzagged in random directions, looping back on themselves like he was wandering in circles. The forest felt different now, like it was alive somehow, shifting and moving around me. Finally, I found myself standing in front of a waterfall I hadn't seen before. The water roared down into a pool below, but behind it was a dark opening, a cave hidden by the rushing water. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in strange pictographs, symbols that looked similar to the ones carved into the trees near our campsite. As I moved deeper into the cave, my flashlight flickered and went out for a moment. When it came back on, I saw them, the remains of the Jensen family scattered across the floor, bones picked clean, clothes torn to shreds, but their faces were still recognizable. They looked like they'd been frozen in their final moments of terror. I stumbled backward, barely able to breathe. That's when I saw something else. A pile of belongings stacked neatly against one wall. Backpacks, shoes, toys, and Harold's fishing hat. "Harold," I whispered into the darkness. There was no answer. When I finally made it back to our RV hours later, Harold was sitting at the table again like nothing had happened. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He wasn't eating anymore. He was just staring at me with this blank expression on his face. His fingers looked longer than they should be, his nails sharper, and when he smiled at me, his teeth weren't right either. I didn't know what to do. He wasn't Harold anymore. Not really, but part of me still wanted to believe he could come back somehow. That night, as he slept, I found a journal tucked under his pillow. It wasn't written entirely in his handwriting. Some of it was scribbled in strange symbols that didn't make any sense to me. One page stood out. "The hunger grows stronger every day." The next morning, I woke up to find Harold gone again. This time, the door to the RV was wide open and his boots were still by the bed. He'd gone out barefoot. I grabbed the flashlight and talisman Marcus had given me and stepped outside. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around my feet as I followed the faint trail of footprints leading into the woods. "Harold," I called out, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" No answer. Just the sound of the rain dripping from the branches above me and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. The footprints led me to a clearing bathed in moonlight. At first, I thought it was empty, but then I saw it, Harold's body, lying in the center of the clearing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. His arms were stretched out to his sides and his chest had been torn open. His organs were missing, replaced by something that looked like roots or vines growing out of him. His face was twisted in pain, but his eyes were closed like he'd finally found peace. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I stumbled closer to him. That's when I heard it. A voice behind me, soft and familiar. "Mabel." I turned around slowly, clutching, the talisman so tightly that it dug into my palm. Standing there was Harold, or at least something that looked like him. But it wasn't him. His skin was pale and stretched too tightly over his bones, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. His mouth moved, but when he spoke, it wasn't. Just his voice. It was a mix of voices, his brother's, even mine. "You've always protected me," it said, stepping closer. "But now, I need you to join me." I backed away, shaking my head. "You're not Harold," I whispered. It smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that showed rows of sharp teeth hidden behind his human ones. "You knew this was coming," Iruhi said. "The guilt, the hunger, it's been growing inside me for years." I realized then that this thing, this Wendigo, had been feeding on Harold's guilt for decades. It had been waiting for him to weaken enough for it to take over. Completely. "You took him from me," I said through clenched teeth, tears streaming down my face. "No," it replied calmly. He gave himself to me willingly. I stood frozen in the clearing, staring at the thing wearing Harold's face. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The talisman Marcus had given me felt warm in my hand, almost like it was alive, but I didn't know if it would be enough to stop this thing. "You're not him," I said again, louder this time. My voice shook, but I forced myself to stand my ground. The creature tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. "I am him," it said in that horrible mix of voices. "And he is me. We are one now." "No," I whispered, clutching the talisman tighter. "You took him from me." It smiled again, wider this time, and its jaw stretched unnaturally, revealing rows of sharp teeth hidden behind Harold's human ones. "He was mine long before you ever met him," it said. "His guilt, his hunger, they called to me, and now they'll call to you too." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the creature stepped closer. Its movements were jerky and wrong, like it wasn't used to controlling a human body. I knew I couldn't run. It would catch me easily in the woods. My only chance was to fight back, but how do you fight something like this? Then I remembered. The journal I'd found in the cave, the one written by the settler who had faced the Wendigo before. He'd written about a ritual, something that could weaken it during a blood-red lunar eclipse. I looked up at the sky and saw the moon glowing faintly through the fog. The eclipse was starting. The moon's light was turning red, just like in the journal's description. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The creature laughed, a horrible sound that echoed through the trees. "You should be," it said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wedding ring, the symbol of everything Harold and I had shared over the past 45 years. It felt heavy in my hand as I held it up to the creature. "This is what you can't take from me," I said firmly. "Our love, our memories, they're mine." The creature snarled and lunged at me, but I was ready. I threw the ring into the fire pit we'd built earlier that day and watched as it melted into a pool of molten gold. Using Marcus's talisman and what I'd learned from the journal, I recited the words of the ritual aloud. My voice shook at first, but as I continued, I felt a strange warmth spreading through me, a strength I didn't know I had. The creature screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that made my ears ring as its body began to dissolve. Its skin peeled away like ash in the wind, revealing its true form, a gaunt, skeletal figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that burned with hunger. As the last of its physical form crumbled into nothingness, the forest fell silent. The fog lifted slightly, and for the first time in days I could see the stars above. I dropped to my knees, exhausted but alive. I sat there in the clearing for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where the creature had stood. The air was still, and for the first time since we'd arrived, the forest felt quiet. Peaceful, almost. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd done what needed to be done, and that Harold, my Harold, was finally at rest. But deep down, something didn't feel right. I made my way back to the RV, my legs shaky and my heart heavy. When I stepped inside, everything looked the same as we'd left it. Harold's fishing gear by the door, my books stacked neatly on the table, the fridge humming softly in the corner. But then I noticed something strange. The fridge was full. Again, not with the food we'd brought, but with raw meat. Packages of it piled high on every shelf. My stomach churned as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I slammed the door shut and turned around, only to freeze in place. There was a sound, a soft whistling coming from the back of the RV. It was a tune I knew well, one Harold used to hum when he was happy. It was our song, the one we danced to on our wedding day. "Harold?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I walked slowly toward the bedroom, my hands trembling as I reached for the door handle. When I opened it, the room was empty. No sign of him. No sign of anyone. But then I caught my reflection in the mirror on the wall, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't me staring back. The woman in the mirror looked like me, but her eyes were different. Darker somehow, with a faint glow that wasn't natural. And when she smiled, her teeth were sharp and jagged, just like the creature's had been. I stumbled back, clutching my chest as a wave of hunger unlike anything I'd ever felt washed over me. It wasn't just hunger. It was a need, deep and primal, clawing at me from the inside. I turned away from the mirror and ran outside, gasping for air. The forest seemed darker now, even though the moonlight was shining through the trees. My hands were shaking as I climbed into the driver's seat of the RV and started the engine. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to leave that place behind. As I drove down the winding road away from the campsite, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had happened in those woods would stay there. But then I felt it again, that hunger gnawing at me from within. And when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my heart stop. A shadow sitting in the back of the RV. It looked like Harold. He smiled at me through the mirror and whispered softly, "We're not done yet." My name is James Rodriguez, and this is the story of how everything changed for me, and for the people I cared about. It started in May 1979, when my friends and I decided to take a trip to celebrate graduating college. We thought it would be fun to escape the city, spend some time in nature, and just enjoy being young before life got serious. But what happened out there in the northern Minnesota wilderness, I don't think any of us could have imagined. We arrived at the lake after driving for hours in Mitch's borrowed RV, a beat-up 1972 Winnebago Indian that rattled every time we hit a bump. The place was beautiful, but strange. The lake was frozen solid even though it was spring, and the air felt colder than it should have been. The pine trees around us were dense, almost too dense, like they were closing in on us. And there was this weird silence. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, nothing. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Mitch Callahan was the one who suggested this location. He said he'd been here before when he was a kid, back when his dad used to take him ice fishing. Mitch was our outdoorsman. He knew how to handle himself in the wilderness. But there was something about him that felt off on this trip. He kept glancing at the lake like it held some kind of secret. Patricia Wilson, my girlfriend, was excited about the trip too. Or at least, she pretended to be. She had her anthropology books with her because she wanted to research indigenous folklore from this area. But I knew she wasn't just here for that. She hadn't told anyone yet. But she was pregnant. With my child. We hadn't figured out how to tell our friends or what we were going to do about it. Heather Frost was our photographer, always snapping pictures of everything around us. She had this artistic way of looking at things, like she could see beauty where no one else could. But lately, she'd been acting a little strange, quiet and distant. She'd told me once that she sometimes had dreams about things before they happened, but I didn't really believe her. When we parked the RV near the lake, Heather immediately started taking photos of the ice formations along the shore. They were weird, shaped like people standing frozen in place, but none of us thought much about it at first. "I've never seen anything like this," Heather said as she adjusted her camera lens. "Probably just some natural phenomenon," Mitch replied casually, though he didn't sound convinced. Patricia found an old trapper's diary tucked away in one of the RV's storage compartments while unpacking. She flipped through it and showed me some of the entries later that evening. It talked about those who walk in winter when it should be spring. I laughed it off. It sounded like something out of a campfire ghost story. That first night, we all sat around a small fire outside the RV, trying to stay warm despite the bitter cold. The temperature had dropped to near zero, even though the weather report said it should have been mild. Heather showed us some of her photos from earlier. One of them looked like there were faces trapped inside the ice formations along the shore. "Do you see that?" Heather asked nervously as she pointed to one photo. "It's just shadows," I said quickly, trying to keep everyone calm. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Heather clicking away on her camera. She was already outside, bundled up in layers, crouching near the shore of the frozen lake. The rest of us were still groggy, trying to shake off the cold that had seeped into the RV overnight. Even with the heater running, it felt like the chill had a mind of its own, creeping into every corner. "Come look at this," Heather called, out, her voice sharp with excitement. Mitch and I stepped outside while Patricia stayed inside to make coffee. Heather pointed to a patch of ice near the edge of the lake. It wasn't just ice. It was shaped like a hand reaching out from under the surface. At first, I thought it was just some weird coincidence, but Heather's face told me she wasn't so sure. "It doesn't look natural," she said quietly. "Probably just the way the ice formed," Mitch replied, brushing it off like he always did. "Stuff like this happens all the time in cold weather, but there was something about it that made my stomach twist. The fingers were too perfect, too lifelike." I didn't say anything more and went back to help Patricia with breakfast. Later, that day, we decided to explore around the lake. Mitch led the way, carrying a small axe in case we needed firewood. The pine trees were so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight, making everything feel darker than it should have been. As we walked, Heather kept stopping to take pictures. Trees, covered in frost, strange patterns in the snow, and more of those human-like shapes frozen in ice. About halfway around the lake, we stumbled across an old ice fishing hut. It looked abandoned. Its wooden walls were warped and cracked from years of exposure to the elements. Inside, we found fishing tools still set up and a journal sitting on a small table. Mitch picked it up and flipped through the pages. "Looks like someone was keeping notes," he said. The handwriting was messy and hard to read, but one entry stood out. "There's something moving under the ice at night. I hear it when everything else is silent." I felt a shiver run down my spine as Mitch read those words aloud. He laughed nervously and tossed the journal back onto the table. "Probably just someone trying to scare people," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe that. Not really. That night, things got even stranger. The temperature dropped again, even lower than before. We could see our breath inside the RV now, and no matter how high we turned up the heater, it didn't seem to make a difference. Outside, an aurora borealis lit up the sky in shades of green and purple. It was beautiful at first, until we noticed something odd. The lights weren't steady. They pulsed in a rhythm that felt unnatural. Every time they pulsed, there was a faint sound coming from somewhere deep under the ice. A low, rumbling noise that made my chest tighten. "What is that?" Patricia asked nervously as she stared out the window. "I don't know," I said. "Honestly." Heather grabbed her camera and stepped outside to take pictures despite how cold it was. When she came back inside an hour later, her hands were red and swollen with frostbite. "I only touched one tree," she whispered as I treated her hands with warm compresses. "It felt wrong." I didn't know what she meant by wrong, but I could see it in her eyes. She was scared. As we sat together in silence that night, I couldn't shake this feeling that something was watching us from outside. The lake seemed alive somehow, like it was waiting for us to make a mistake. The next morning, things felt off. The RV was colder than ever, and the windows were completely frosted over. It didn't make sense. This was May, not the middle of winter. I stepped outside to get some fresh air, but the moment I did, the silence hit me again. No birds, no wind, no rustling branches. Just nothing. Patricia came out a few minutes later, holding the old trapper's diary she'd found in the RV. She flipped through it quickly, her fingers trembling from the cold. "Listen to this," she said, her voice low. "It says, 'They come when the ice shouldn't be here. They walk in the cold and take what they need. What do you think that means? I shrugged, trying to act like it didn't bother me. Probably just some old legend or superstition. But Patricia didn't look convinced. She closed the diary and stared out at the lake. What if it's not just a story? Before I could answer, Mitch joined us outside. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept all night. He kept glancing at the lake again, his jaw tight. I need to tell you something, he said suddenly. My dad, he disappeared here. Patricia and I exchanged a look. What do you mean? I asked. Mitch sighed and ran a hand through his hair. When I was 8, my dad came here to go ice fishing. He never came back. They found his fishing gear near a hole in the ice, but no sign of him. Everyone said he probably fell in and drowned, but I don't know. It never felt right. I didn't know what to say to that. Mitch had always been the strong one in our group, the guy who never let anything get to him. Seeing him like this made me feel uneasy. That afternoon, we all stayed, close to the RV. No one wanted to admit it, but we were scared. Heather spent most of her time looking through her camera lens, snapping photos of anything that caught her eye. Patricia read more of the trapper's diary while Mitch chopped firewood nearby. As the sun started to set, something strange happened. The aurora borealis came back, those same green and purple lights, but this time they were brighter and closer than before. They seemed to ripple across the sky like waves on water. And then we heard it again, that sound from under the ice. It was louder now, like something huge was moving beneath the surface. What is that? Heather whispered as she aimed her camera toward the lake. None of us answered because none of us knew. Later that night, we sat huddled inside the RV with every light on. The heater was barely working now, and we could see frost creeping along the walls inside. Mitch tried to fix it but gave up after an hour. As we talked quietly about whether we should leave in the morning, Heather suddenly gasped and pointed out the window. Look, she said. We all turned to see what she was pointing at, and my heart stopped. There were footprints in the snow leading from the lake toward our RV. They were huge, much bigger than any human footprints, and they seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight as if they were made of ice. No one went out there, Patricia whispered shakily. Then who or what made those? Mitch said grimly. No one had an answer. That night, none of us slept well. Every sound outside made us jump, branches creaking in the wind. If there even was wind, faint cracking noises from the lake. It all felt wrong somehow. By morning, we were all exhausted and on edge. But things were about to get much worse. By the time the sun rose, we were all desperate for answers. The heater in the RV had completely stopped working overnight, and even the coffee Patricia made tasted cold before we could finish it. Mitch suggested we look for firewood, and honestly, I think we all just wanted to get out of the RV for a while. Sitting in there with those icy footprints outside felt like waiting for something bad to happen. We bundled up and headed into the woods, sticking close together. The trees were so thick that it felt like they were swallowing us whole. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. After about an hour of walking, we stumbled across a small cabin tucked away in a clearing. It looked old, like it had been standing there for decades. Smoke was curling out of the chimney, which meant someone was inside. Mitch knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. An old man stood there, his face weathered and lined like tree bark. He had a long gray beard and piercing, blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. "You're not from around here," he said in a gravelly voice. "We're just camping by the lake," Mitch replied. "Our heater's broken, and we were hoping to find some firewood." The man nodded slowly and stepped aside to let us in. The inside of the cabin was small but warm, with a fire crackling in the stone fireplace. Animal pelts hung on the walls, and shelves were lined with jars of what looked like dried herbs. "My name's Walter," he said as he motioned for us to sit down. "What brings you out here?" Mitch hesitated for a moment before answering. "We're just here to celebrate graduation. Thought it'd be nice to get away." Walter didn't say anything for a while. He just stared at us like he was trying to figure something out. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. "What do you mean?" Patricia asked nervously. Walter leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "This place. It's not safe. There are things out there that don't belong in this world." Heather shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "What kind of things?" Walter sighed and rubbed his hands together as if trying to warm them up. "The people who lived here long before us, they talked about spirits that walk in winter when it should be spring. They said these spirits hunger for warmth, for life." I felt a chill run down my spine. It sounded too much like what we'd read in the Trapper's Diary. "Is that why the lake's frozen?" Mitch asked. Walter nodded grimly. "The ice is their domain, and those stone formations around the lake, they're wards meant to keep them trapped, but someone disturbed them." "Disturbed them how?" I asked. Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the window, peering out at the forest as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. "You need to stay off that ice," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "No matter what you see or hear, don't go out there." We left Walter's cabin with more questions than answers. His warning stayed with me as we made our way back to the RV, but deep down, I think we all knew it was already too late. When we got back to the RV, the air felt heavier, colder, like the forest was closing in on us. None of us said much as we sat around the table trying to process what Walter had told us. Patricia kept flipping through the Trapper's Diary, her brow furrowed in concentration. Heather stared out the window, her camera resting in her lap. Mitch was unusually quiet, his hands clenched into fists. The tension finally broke when Patricia and I started arguing. She wanted to go out onto the ice to see for herself, but I told her it was too dangerous. Walter's warning had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. "You can't just ignore this," Patricia snapped, slamming the diary shut. "There's something out there, James. If we don't figure out what's happening, we could be next." "And walking onto a frozen lake is your solution," I shot back. "That's insane." Patricia glared at me, her cheeks flushed from frustration, or maybe the cold. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just some camping trip anymore. Something's wrong here." Before I could respond, she grabbed her coat and stormed out of the RV. "Patricia!" I called after her, but she didn't stop. Heather stood up to follow her, but Mitch held up a hand. "Let her cool off," he said quietly. "She'll come back." I didn't like it, but I sat down and waited. Minutes turned into hours, and Patricia still hadn't returned. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the frozen lake. "Okay, this is ridiculous," I said finally, grabbing my coat. "We need to find her." Heather and Mitch nodded, and we all headed out together. The cold bit into my skin as we walked toward the lake, our footsteps crunching in the snow. Heather carried her camera like it was a shield, snapping pictures of every little thing as we moved. When we reached the edge of the lake, we saw Patricia's footprints leading toward the center, but they just stopped. There was no sign of her anywhere. "She wouldn't just walk out there," Heather whispered nervously, "unless—" Mitch trailed off, his eyes scanning the ice. "Unless what?" I demanded. Mitch didn't answer right away. He crouched down and touched one of the footprints with his glove. "It's like they froze solid." I felt my chest tighten as I looked around desperately for any sign of Patricia. The lake stretched out endlessly before us, its surface smooth and eerily reflective. And then we saw her. She was walking across the ice toward us. But something about her movements wasn't right. Her steps were stiff and jerky like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "Patricia!" I shouted. She didn't respond. Heather raised her camera and snapped a photo before lowering it again with trembling hands. James, that's not her. What are you talking about? I demanded. Heather handed me the camera so I could see for myself. In the photo, Patricia's face looked distorted. Her eyes were blank and her skin seemed to shimmer like ice under the moonlight. Mitch grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the shore. We need to go. No, I shouted, breaking free from his grip. She needs help. But before I could take another step onto the ice, Patricia stopped moving, and then she turned to face us fully. Her mouth opened as if she were about to speak, but instead of words, a low, cracking sound echoed across the lake, and then she shattered. Her body split apart into jagged pieces of ice that scattered across the surface like broken glass. I froze in place, unable to process what I'd just seen. Heather dropped her camera in shock while Mitch grabbed my arm again and dragged me back toward the RV. We're leaving, he said firmly. But deep down, I think we all knew it wasn't going to be that simple. After what happened to Patricia, the RV felt like a prison. None of us wanted to be outside, but staying inside wasn't much better. The heater had completely died, and frost was spreading across the walls like veins. Every time we exhaled, our breath hung in the air like smoke. It didn't feel like spring anymore. It felt like the dead of winter. Mitch sat by the window staring out at the lake. Heather was curled up in one of the RV's chairs, clutching her camera like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I couldn't stop pacing back and forth, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. What do we do now? Heather asked quietly, breaking the silence. Mitch didn't look away from the window. We survive. That's not a plan, I snapped. We need to get out of here. And go where? Mitch shot back. The roads are blocked by snowdrifts and the engine's frozen solid. We're stuck. I hated that he was right. The RV wasn't going anywhere, and even if it could, I wasn't sure we'd make it far in this cold. Heather suddenly sat up straighter, her eyes wide. Did you hear that? We all froze and listened. At first, there was nothing, but then I heard it too, a faint cracking sound coming from outside, like ice breaking under pressure. It's coming closer, Heather whispered. Mitch grabbed his axe and motioned for us to stay put while he went to check it out. I wanted to stop him. I wanted all of us to stay together, but he was already out the door before I could say anything. Heather and I waited in silence, listening to every sound outside. The cracking grew louder, then stopped altogether. A few minutes later, Mitch came back inside, his face pale. What is it? I asked. He shook his head slowly. Walter's cabin. It's gone. What do you mean, gone? Heather asked. I mean, it's covered in ice, Mitch said grimly. The whole place is frozen solid, and there are sculptures inside. Sculptures? I repeated. Mitch nodded. People. Frozen people. They're standing there like they're alive, but trapped. I felt my stomach drop as his words sank in. Walter had warned us about staying off the ice, but maybe it wasn't just the ice we needed to avoid. Later that night, things got worse. The water pipes in the RV burst one by one, spraying freezing water everywhere until we had no choice but to shut them off completely. The cold was relentless now. It felt like it was alive, creeping into every corner and stealing what little warmth we had left. And then, we saw them. Through the frosted windows of the RV, figures began appearing on the lake, dozens of them. They moved slowly and methodically, their steps perfectly synchronized as they walked toward the center of the ice. Are those people? Heather asked, shakily. No, Mitch said firmly. They're not. I squinted through the glass and realized he was right. The figures weren't human. They were made of ice, their bodies shimmering under the moonlight like frozen statues come to life. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Mitch's father was among them. Mitch, I started to say, but he cut me off. I see him, he said quietly. His father looked exactly as Mitch had described him, tall with broad shoulders and a thick beard. but his movements were wrong. He walked stiffly like all the others, his head tilted slightly to one side as if he were listening for something. "They're coming closer," Heather said urgently. "We need to get out of here," I said again. But deep down, I knew there was nowhere left to run. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the RV, trying to keep warm and stay calm. None of us slept. The figures on the lake stayed visible for hours, moving slowly in circles near the center. Every now and then, I thought I saw one of them glance toward the RV, but I told myself it was just my imagination. By morning, we knew we couldn't stay here any longer. Heather suggested we search the woods for more clues, anything that could help us understand what was happening. Mitch agreed, though he looked like he was barely holding himself together after seeing his father among those frozen figures. We bundled up and headed out again, sticking close to each other. The cold was worse than ever, biting through our coats and scarves like they weren't even there. Heather carried her camera, snapping pictures as we walked. Mitch held his axe tightly, his knuckles white from gripping it so hard. About an hour into our search, we found her, Dr. Diane Monroe. She was lying in the snow near a cluster of frozen trees, barely conscious. Her skin was pale, her lips blue, and ice crystals had started forming on her hair and clothes. Mitch crouched beside her and shook her gently. "Dr. Monroe?" he asked. Her eyes fluttered open, but she didn't seem to recognize us at first. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered weakly. "We know," I said quickly, "but we're trapped. Can you tell us what's going on?" Dr. Monroe shivered violently before managing a few words. "The government, they've been studying this place for years. Temperature anomalies, magnetic fields. It's not natural." "What's causing it?" Heather asked urgently. Dr. Monroe's gaze shifted toward the lake, her eyes filled with fear. "It wakes up every 50 years. It needs to feed." "What wakes up?" Mitch demanded. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a map of the area with a red X marked near the lake's edge. "There's a stone chamber," she said faintly. "It's ancient. It tells the story." Before we could ask anything else, Dr. Monroe went still. Ice crystals spread across her face as if she were freezing from the inside out. Mitch checked her pulse and shook his head. "She's gone," he said quietly. We followed the map to the spot marked with the red X and found what Dr. Monroe had described, a stone chamber hidden beneath layers of frost and snow. It took all 3 of us to clear enough of the ice to get inside. The chamber was small but filled with carvings and pictographs that told a story about an ancient entity called the Ice Walker. Heather took pictures while Mitch and I tried to make sense of the carvings. They showed figures walking across frozen landscapes, their bodies encased in ice. The Ice Walker was at the center of it all, a towering figure made entirely of ice with human remains suspended inside its hollow core. "It preserves them," Heather said softly as she studied one of the carvings. "It keeps them frozen forever." "But why?" I asked. Mitch pointed to another carving, a spiral pattern filled with frozen figures arranged around the Ice Walker like offerings. "It needs them to survive." Heather suddenly gasped and held up one of her photos from earlier, the one of Patricia walking across the lake before she shattered into ice shards. "She wasn't herself," Heather said shakily. "She was already part of it." I felt my stomach drop as I realized what she meant. Patricia hadn't just disappeared. She'd been taken by the Ice Walker and turned into one of its frozen puppets. And now, it was coming for us too. We didn't go back to the RV after finding the stone chamber. It didn't feel safe anymore. Not that anywhere felt safe, but staying near the lake felt like asking for trouble. Mitch was the one who suggested we go, onto the ice. I thought he was crazy at first, but when he explained why, I started to understand. "If we don't stop this thing," he said, gripping his axe tightly, "we're not getting out of here alive." Heather didn't argue. She just stared at him, her camera hanging loosely around her neck. I could tell she was scared. So was I. But what choice did we have? The ice walker wasn't going to let us leave. It had already taken Patricia and Dr. Monroe. If we didn't do something, we'd be next. We waited until nightfall before stepping onto the ice. The aurora borealis was back, pulsing in strange rhythms above us as if it were alive. The cold was unbearable now. Every breath felt like knives cutting into my lungs. Heather walked ahead with her camera, snapping pictures of the ice formations. As we moved toward the center of the lake, "Do you see that?" she asked suddenly, pointing toward the ground. I crouched down and squinted at the ice beneath us. At first, it looked like nothing, but then I saw it. Shadows moving under the surface, twisting and writhing like they were alive. "It's underneath us," Mitch said grimly. We kept walking until we reached what looked like a massive crack in the ice. Heather raised her camera and took a photo, then gasped when she looked at the image. "There's something down there," she whispered. Mitch didn't hesitate. He swung his axe at the crack, shattering a small section of ice. The moment he did, a loud rumbling sound echoed across the lake. The shadows beneath us grew darker and more defined until they started rising toward the surface. And then it appeared. The ice walker rose from the crack in the ice, towering over us like something out of a nightmare. Its body was semi-transparent, shimmering in the moonlight like frozen glass. Inside its hollow core, I could see human remains suspended. In place, arms, legs, faces, all perfectly preserved. Its face was blank, just a smooth sheet of ice that reflected our faces back at us like mirrors. When it moved, it made a sound like breaking glass, a sharp, cracking noise that sent chills down my spine. Mitch stepped forward with his axe raised. "You took my dad," he shouted. The ice walker tilted its head slightly as if it were listening. Then it spoke, not with words but with voices, dozens of them all speaking at once. Among them was Mitch's father's voice. "I'm still here," it said through Mitch's father's voice. "You can join me." Mitch froze in place, his grip on the axe faltering. "Don't listen to it," Heather shouted, but Mitch couldn't move. The ice walker reached out toward him with one massive hand made of jagged ice shards, and before I could stop it, it touched him. Mitch's body froze instantly, his skin turning pale as frost spread across him like wildfire. He dropped to his knees before falling onto his side, completely encased in ice. Heather screamed and fired off a flare gun she'd been carrying in her coat pocket. The bright light shot into the air and exploded above us in a burst of heat and fire. For a moment, the ice walker recoiled as if it were in pain, but then it turned its attention toward Heather. "Run!" she shouted at me as she fired another flare directly at its chest. I didn't want to leave her. I wanted to fight, but deep down I knew there was nothing I could do to save her. So I ran. I sprinted across the ice toward the shore as fast as I could, barely looking back. Behind me, I heard Heather scream again. Then silence. When I reached solid ground, I turned around just in time to see the ice walker collapse into itself, disappearing, back into the crack in the ice along with Heather's flare gun and everything else around it. The auroras flickered one last time before fading completely, leaving only darkness behind. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, stumbling through the snow and ice as my mind raced. Mitch was gone. Heather was gone. Patricia was gone. I was the only one left. When I reached the RV, it felt like stepping into a tomb. The frost-covered walls, the frozen pipes, the silence. It all felt heavier now, suffocating. I slammed the door shut behind me and collapsed onto one of the chairs, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. For a moment, I thought about trying to start the engine, but I already knew it wouldn't work. The cold had frozen everything solid. Still, I had to try. I grabbed the keys from the counter and turned them in the ignition. Nothing. I tried again and again until my hands were shaking, but it was useless. The RV wasn't going anywhere. That's when I noticed something strange. The frost on the windows was starting to melt. Slowly but surely, Tiny droplets of water trickled down the glass as if the temperature outside was finally warming up. I stepped outside to check, and sure enough, the air didn't feel as bitter as before. The lake was still frozen, but there was no sign of the ice walker or its frozen figures. It was as if they had never been there at all. I didn't waste any more time. Grabbing what little gear I could carry, I started walking toward the road we'd come in on. The snowdrifts were still high, but they didn't seem as impossible to cross now. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was starting to rise. The warmth on my face felt almost unreal after everything that had happened. For a brief moment, I let myself believe it was over, that I'd escaped. But then, I found Patricia's journal. It was sitting on the passenger seat of an old truck, parked near the edge of the road, one that hadn't been there when we arrived days ago. My hands trembled as I picked it up and flipped through its pages. The last few entries weren't written by Patricia, not in her handwriting anyway. They were drawings instead, sketches of me walking away from the lake, carrying a backpack, just like I was now. The date on the page: 3 days before today. My stomach twisted as I turned to the final page of the journal. There was one last drawing, one that made my blood run cold. It showed me standing in front of a mirror with ice, crystals growing from my eyes and mouth. I dropped the journal and stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. No, it couldn't be real. But then I caught my reflection in one of the truck's side mirrors and froze. Tiny shards of ice were forming at the corners of my eyes, spreading outward like frost on a window pane. My breath fogged up the glass as I stared at myself, unable to look away. And then I smiled, not because I wanted to, but because something deep inside me did. Maybe it wasn't over after all.